Franz Kafka was a Czech-born 20th century writer and novelist who wrote in German language. But it was only after his death he got the fame through which we know him now. When you read his novels, or in fact his short stories even, you find a deep sense of melancholy, that pain and suffering. The story of a helpless man who is often tortured by the authority, whether it's the state, the society, or even the family and parents. So in the novel, The Trial, it's the state and the bureaucracy, and in the Metamorphosis, it's the family. Both of which are fantastic works which you should read, and despite all the pain and suffering that you find in these books, you find a sense of healing too. It's rather ironical that most of the books that heal us emotionally are not the ones that provide instant happiness or full of jokes and cheerful events. On the contrary, they are full of sad events, tragedies, in which we can relate to the protagonist, to the situations, and there we find a sense of comfort. And that's precisely the case with Kafka's books, and that's why they offer such good healing. But in today's podcast, instead of talking about his books, I'll talk about one particular letter that he wrote to his father. He had a very difficult childhood, and especially because of his narcissistic and abusive father, and whose abusive behavior haunted and traumatized Kafka all his life. And then at one point in his life, he writes this really long letter to his father, and gives it to his mother to pass on to the father. But then the mother, who was always scared of the father, she never gives that letter to the father and returns it to Franz Kafka after a few days. So the father never read the letter, but it seems that the rest of the world now has. And it's a really long letter. You should read it. It's of somewhere around 50 odd pages. And you find even such a good writer like Franz Kafka, he is struggling to articulate himself, to articulate his pain. And that gives us such a clear window to an artist's mind. And when they describe pain and suffering, how beautifully and with their brilliant craft they paint this picture, but seldom do we realize that they themselves are carrying a lot of burden, and which manifests often in their works of art. So I won't read the whole letter, but I will read certain parts of it, and you will get a good sense of what he's trying to say here. It's available as a separate book, so you can find it and read it for yourself. So now let me narrate the letter for you. I mean, the parts of it. Dearest Father, you asked me recently why I claim to be afraid of you. I did not know, as usual, how to answer, partly for the very reason that I am afraid of you, partly because an explanation of my fear would require more details than I could even begin to make coherent in speech. And if I now try to answer in writing, it will still be nowhere near complete, because even in writing, my fear and its consequences raise a barrier between us, and because the magnitude of material far exceeds my memory and my understanding. To you, the matter always seemed very simple, at least in as far as you spoke about it in front of me, and indiscriminately in front of many others. To you, it seemed like this. You had worked hard your whole life, sacrificed everything for your children, particularly me. As a result, I lived like a lord, had complete freedom to study whatever I wanted, knew where my next meal was coming from, and therefore had no reason to worry about anything. For this, you asked no gratitude. You know how many children show their gratitude. But at least some kind of cooperation, a sign of sympathy. Instead, I would always hide away from you in my room, buried in books with crazy friends and eccentric ideas. We never spoke openly. I never came up to you in the synagogue. I never visited you, nor otherwise had any sense of family. I never took an interest in the business or your other concerns. I saddled you with the factory and then left you in the lurk. I encouraged Otla's obstinacy, and while I have never to this day lifted a finger to help you, I do all I can for perfect strangers. If you summarize your judgment of me, it is clear that you do not actually reproach me with anything really indecent or malicious, but rather with coldness, alienation, ingratitude. And what is more, you reproach me as if it were my fault, as if I might have been able to arrange everything differently once with one simple thing of direction, while you are not in the slightest to blame, except perhaps for having been too good to me. This, your usual analysis, I agree with only insofar as I also believe you to be entirely blameless for our estrangement. But I too am equally and utterly blameless. If I could bring you to acknowledge this, then although a new life would not be possible, for that we are both much too old, there could yet be a sort of peace, not an end to your unrelenting reproaches, but at least a mitigation of them. I was an anxious child, and yet I'm sure I was also disobedient as children are. I'm sure that mother spoilt me too, but I cannot believe that I was particularly difficult to handle. I cannot believe that you, by directing a friendly word my way, by quietly taking my hand or by giving me a kind look, could not have got everything you wanted from me. And you're fundamentally a kind and a tender person. But not every child has the tenacity and fearlessness to search until he finds the kindness within. You, Father, are only capable of treating a child with the same means by which you were molded, with vigor, noise, and fits of rage. And in my case, you found these means especially appropriate because you wanted to bring me up to be a strong, courageous boy. There's only one episode from those early years that I remember directly. Perhaps you remember it too. I was whining persistently for water one night. Certainly not because I was thirsty, but in all probability partly to be annoying, partly to amuse myself. After a number of fierce threats had failed, you lifted me out of my bed, carried me out onto the balcony, and left me a while all alone, standing outside the locked door in my nightshirt. I do not mean to say that this was wrong of you. Perhaps at that time there really was no other way of having a peaceful night. But I mention it as a characteristic example of the way you brought me up and the effect it had on me. This incident almost certainly made me obedient for a time, but it damaged me on the inside. I was by nature unable to reconcile the simple act of casually asking for water with the utter horror of being carried outside. Years later, it still tormented me that this giant man, my father, the ultimate authority, could enter my room at any time and almost unprovoked carry me from my bed out onto the balcony, and that I meant so little to him. That was merely the beginning of things. But this feeling of powerlessness, which still regularly overcomes me, stems in many ways from how you treated me. What I needed was a little encouragement, a little friendliness, a little help to keep my future open. Instead, you obstructed me. Admittedly, with the good intention of persuading me to go down a different path. But I was not fit for the path you chose. You encouraged me, for example, whenever I saluted or marched well. But I was no budding soldier. Or you encouraged me when I could bring myself to eat heartily, especially when I drank beer or when I managed to sing songs that I did not understand, or to parrot your own favorite cliches back to you. But none of it had a place in my future. And even today, it is typical of you only to encourage me in something that it engages your interest. When your own self-esteem is at stake, threatened either by me or by others through me. Then you give me encouragement, remind me of what I am worth, what sort of woman I could marry, and condemn Peppa out of hand. But apart from the fact that I am, even at my present age, already virtually impervious to encouragement, I have to ask myself what good it could do to me anyway, as it is only ever offered when I am not its primary object. The next outward result of my whole upbringing was that I ran away from everything that even remotely reminded me of you. Firstly, the business. As a street shop, it should have delighted me, particularly in my childhood. It was so lively, lit up in the evenings. I saw and heard so much, could help here and there show my skills. But above all, I could marvel at your great talent for business, how you sold things, dealt with people, made jokes, never tired, immediately knew what to do in a difficult situation, etc. Even the way you packaged goods or opened a box was a spectacle worth watching, and the whole thing was, all in all, certainly not the worst education for a child. But as you came to scare me gradually and in every respect, and as I became unable to distinguish you from the shop, I no longer felt comfortable even there. Things there that I had initially taken for granted came to torment and embarrass me, particularly your treatment of the staff. I do not know, perhaps it was normal for staff to be treated that way in the workplace. But as a child, I was not concerned with other workplaces. I saw only you screaming, shouting abuse and raging about the shop, something which I could not believe ever happened elsewhere in the world. And there was not only verbal abuse, but other sorts of tyranny too. For example, when you wanted certain goods not to be confused with others, and to prove your point, sent them flying from the counter with a single swipe. Only the blindness of your rage excused you slightly, and the clerk would have to pick them up. And finally he writes, in reality, of course, things cannot fit together as neatly as the evidence in my letter. Life is more complicated than a jigsaw puzzle. But with the adjustment that this reproach brings, an adjustment on which I am neither able nor willing to elaborate, I have reached something that, in my opinion, so closely resembles the truth that it might comfort us both a little and make it easier for us to live and die. Franz.